With the national debate going on about do nations need border walls, I'm doing this video to try to answer one interesting question. Is God in favor of border walls and national sovereignty? First, let's look at scriptures. God seems to have been in favor of national jurisdictions. In Mark 12:17, Jesus tells us to render to Caesar his due. In Romans 13:1-7, the Apostle Paul says we must submit to governmental authorities. Rulers are rulers by virtue of jurisdiction over territory. It seems that God himself established the very idea of nations and borders. Looking at Acts 17:26, he declared, "From one man he," meaning God, "made all of the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands." Some people say that when Jesus was born and had to escape to Egypt to avoid being killed by King Herod, that his family crossed illegally into Egypt and became refugees. An Indianapolis, Indiana Episcopal Church on Monument Circle had a recent display on their property showing Jesus and his family barricaded in by border fences. They said, "See, even Jesus needed to cross borders in order to avoid persecution." While it's true that the family did cross the border to Egypt, there are some differences. First, did they have to apply for official refugee status at the time? Probably not. Those kind of policies were not used then, and there probably weren't any border structures and precise established boundaries at the time. Scriptures are wrought with nations that built and relied on walls for safety. Around 590 BC, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the Jewish people were forced into exile. Still, 70 years later, Jerusalem's protective walls and gates were broken and burned with fire. Nehemiah was a high official at the Persian court of King Artaxerxes at the capital city of Susa. Nehemiah served as the king's cupbearer, which afforded him the opportunity to speak to the king and request favors from him. After hearing about the poor situation in Judah, Nehemiah received the king's permission to go to Jerusalem and to help rebuild the city and its fortifications. As the Jewish people were allowed to return to their homeland, temple worship was restored. In 520 BC, their new temple was started and completed in 515 BC. Once the temple was completed, Nehemiah would return later and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem in just 52 days. Some of the wall sections only needed repairing, but other areas required completely new walling. One can't forget, though, that God wanted the temple built first before the walls of the city. In fact, the walls were finished 92 years after the first group of Israeli captives returned. God seemed to want them spiritually strong and secure first, before anyone relied on exterior security walls. Again, you can look to today to see how the nation of Israel still relies heavily on border walls for protection. The nation of Israel has cut its illegal immigration rate by 99% by building a 143-mile fence along its southern border. Israel had a real problem before the wall was constructed, with over 16,000 illegal immigrants coming in a year or so earlier. After the wall, the numbers crossing illegally went down to about 18. There are many Bible scriptures that give indication of countries building border walls. Take, for example, the walls found in Jericho. The Canaanites used a large border wall to protect themselves from outside invaders, maybe as high as 40 feet tall. Before the Israelites entered the Promised Land, Moses told them that they were now about to cross the Jordan River to dispossess nations which were greater and stronger than themselves. Some large cities having walls, apparently, as it were to the sky. The Israelites were told to circle the city of Jericho 7 times. When the 7th trip was completed, Scripture tells us that the walls of Jericho fell flat down. That's Joshua 6:20. The Israelites then took possession of the land. We only have to look at the Great Wall of China to see the biggest example of a border wall. The most extensive and best preserved portions of the Great Wall dates from the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, and runs for some 5,500 miles. The wall sections were built to give individual Chinese kingdoms protection from not only their neighbors, but from other outside barbarian invasions or raids. While religious rights have overall increased in China some the last 25 or so years, their border walls are a reminder, too, that walls can also be used to keep people in, to maintain control over the masses. One final example of how God may feel about open borders is not really about border walls. Genesis 11:1-9 are scriptures concerning the Tower of Babel. The people of the world had come together in an arrogant pursuit to build a tower to God in heaven. At the time, there was only one world language, and most people lived in one geographic location. As they began to build the tower and it grew taller, God intervened and caused the people to suddenly speak multiple languages in order to confuse them. The Tower of Babel is a symbol of humanity's ability and propensity to cross boundaries in search of power, and God's opposite reaction to check such behavior. From now on, people would speak several languages and live in multiple locations across the world. God seemed to be saying that from now on, sovereign nations, cultures, and different languages would have to exist. And He didn't want them to be a melting pot with no national borders. In my opinion, the scriptures seem to say that open borders, allowing unregulated moving between countries, is not really what God had in mind. You may have a different point of view, though. From Indiana, this is H.A. Graves saying goodbye until next time.